Joining the training this afternoon, Ish. I wonder if you could just start by introducing yourself and saying a little bit about the sample that you did your research on.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ishmael Husbands. I'm a newly qualified clinical psychologist, and my thesis was looking at the experiences of global majority trainees, their experiences of microaggressions whilst on clinical training. Um, and then I did, yeah, a conceptual review thinking about psychological safety. So the sample size, there were about 37. Yeah, there were 37 global majority trainees from across the country, mostly England, but we also had a few from Wales and Scotland contribute to the survey. It was an online survey, and they just, yeah, it was lots of open-ended questions, and they kind of just spoke about their experiences of microaggressions and the different types of microaggressions that they experience, and like the different sources that it came from, like the teaching material or supervisors or peers, service users, etc., to try and kind of unpick what the lived experience of microaggressions actually are. Yeah.
Thanks, Ish. And I know your research looked at the wider ecology of harm experienced during training. For our purposes and for our audience, we're thinking
Mhm.
about kind of supervision in a more focused way. And I wanted just to start off with, if you could give some examples of the kind of microaggressions done by white supervisors towards global majority trainees, whether that's intentional or unintentional.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to kind of differentiate between some of the microaggressions might be unintentional, and actually most of them were. So yeah, it varied. I think, there were people speaking about having supervisors misrecognize them as either a patient or sometimes as someone who isn't a trainee. So, waiting in the waiting area to kind of do that kind of like pre-placement visit the first time supervisors meeting them, and the supervisor assuming that they're not the trainee. That's something that kind of came up quite often, and trainees kind of spoke about that kind of communicating to them that they don't belong or that they shouldn't be a trainee if they're not being received or viewed as such. Um, there was also lots of experiences of kind of trainees talking about their level of competence being viewed as something that it wasn't actually, and it went both ways. I think there was sometimes the underestimation of level of competence, which kind of led then trainees to feel like they were being over scrutinized or micromanaged or over supported. And then there was lots of experiences also of people maybe overestimating, maybe not competence, but kind of level of resilience and being able to cope and manage with lots of stress and lots of, the idea of resilience, right? And that maybe can kind of made trainees feel like they were being under supported. What kind of other things came up? There was lots of experiences around also. It's kind of like a double bind, right? It's maybe like trainees feeling like their knowledge wasn't necessarily, I guess, talking about cultural knowledge, not being valued in the same way, or feeling like it was more easily dismissed. When, I don't know, thinking about the cultural elements of maybe like a formulation, but equally, if there were any kind of like cultural differences, being positioned as the expert is also something that came up quite a lot in the data. Um,
Oh, can I just come in there, Ish? So that's sort of
yeah, sure.
like the supervisor, rather than realizing it's their responsibility, it's their CPD, putting it on the trainee to do the work, to do the emotional labor of educating the white supervisor.
Yeah, and maybe at some point we'll come onto that, but it kind of extended outside of the supervisory relationship where the supervisor would expect the trainee to kind of take that expert or teacher role, but also then to be teaching the team. Um, and as you can imagine, there's that comes with a lot of well, it's additional stress, right? Training is already stressful, and then that's an additional layer that global majority trainees have to deal with that perhaps a white trainee might not have to deal with in the same way. I was going to say something else and it's gone out of my mind. Hopefully it will come back to me. Um, yeah, it's gone.
Can I pick up on something that you said? Because you talked
Yeah.
about being under-supported or over-supported. And I
Mm.
noticed in your analysis that you talked about that. I mean, for one example, I thought was that they're hyper visible and then missed or not seen. I wonder if you could speak a bit to that, how that plays out.
Yeah, so I guess it's kind of similar to the over-supported and under-supported. A lot of trainees kind of spoke about feeling quite invisible and not being seen, or their difference maybe not being seen, or not, or being seen as a stereotype of whatever embodiment of difference is visible, but them as a person and their humanness not being seen. So maybe not being offered the same support, not being offered the same care, not being offered the same level of consideration as some of their peers. And that's something that came up, not just I guess, that can feel quite challenging to have to deal with, but then also trying to communicate that and maybe it not being believed or it being dismissed. That's what I was going to say. I guess the in supervision there's a power dynamic, and I think when a trainee is coming to supervision to raise maybe some of these issues that come up, there was often a sense that either I don't want to say too much because my supervisor is marking me and I don't want to fail the placement, or I don't want to be graded lower, or I don't want to be viewed as quote unquote a difficult trainee. So that can often sometimes result in people silencing themselves and not speaking up and not raising very live and very real concerns that they have.
And I think that was another one you spoke to, the silence, but also being silenced. I wondered if
Mm.
you could add a bit more about the being silenced side and how supervisors might participate in that discourse.
Yeah, so I guess a way that that can come across, or a version of how that can look, is I guess if there's a trainee who's sharing their lived experience, some participants spoke about that being met with the supervisor, sorry, sharing their perspective, and then there being a narrative within the supervisory space that the supervisor's perspective is the truth, and there not being then space or an invitation that there's multiple perspectives and multiple truths. And I think that's maybe one of the subtle, or maybe not so subtle, ways that the power dynamics can facilitate a global majority trainee feeling quite silenced.
I just wonder if there's any other um, key themes in the sort of microaggressions that global majority trainees might experience in
Mm.
supervision.
So I feel like we kind of touched on the bulk of them. So the feeling silenced and then the self-silencing that can happen. There's also quite a lot of maybe, we spoke about people feeling like their knowledge is, or their knowledge being, not, it's not a feeling, but their knowledge being dismissed and not regarded in the same way as a lot of maybe like Western ideas or mainstream psychological knowledge. Um, and yeah, maybe also something about trainees feeling quite stereotyped. So there was a few, participants who spoke about, comments about their language proficiency or the accent that they had. So there's kind of this undertone of they were expected to talk in a particular way and they didn't meet that expectation. So there's those sorts of maybe prejudice or stereotypical thinking that impact on how trainees are being perceived. Mm.
Thank you. And thank you for that brief summary. I know when it's published, we'll be directing our listeners to the paper. I just wondered, moving on a little bit, if you could say something about what supervisors can do to limit the risk of
Mm.
microaggressions in supervision or diminish their impact if and when they happen.
So it's hard to condense it all into a short time frame, but I think something that can be done is an openness and a humility. So an acknowledgement that, you know, we're all human and we can't all get things right all the time, and mistakes are more than likely going to happen, but being, I guess, kind of communicating that there's an openness to learning and doing things differently, but also an openness to feedback and being held accountable
Mm.
and not, and I guess the being held accountable, there's holding yourself accountable, but also being open to others holding you accountable, because I feel like those are quite different things, right?
Mm.
Especially when you then layer on the power dynamic. Um, so yeah, I've mentioned a few different things there, but I think, yeah, a humility, acknowledgement that I'm not perfect and I'm going to make mistakes, I'm going to get things wrong, and being able to name that, a conscious effort to then learn from those mistakes, and an openness to kind of being able to receive feedback, and being held accountable, but also being able to hold yourself accountable. I feel like those things, hopefully, when they're being experienced in the supervisory relationship, that will help foster a space where the global majority trainee will feel safe and will trust that I can take risks to bring these types of things to this supervisory space.
Mm. Thank you. And just, I guess, stepping forward from that, that's about
Mm.
prevention maybe, but how how can a supervisor enable feedback when supporters get it wrong, when there are microaggressions, when there is some kind of rupture in the relationship?
I think in the contracting, how the supervision space is set up in the very beginning, um, and kind of discussing how, like, what kind of repair process would we both want within the context of the supervisory space? I think it's important to have those conversations when there hasn't already been a rupture, because I think it can be difficult to then be dealing with a rupture and trying to repair it, and also figuring out the best way to repair for both people. That's a lot to be doing at one point in time. So I think having those conversations earlier, to kind of figure out what that process might need to look like.
Mm. I think I just want to think back to our supervisory relationship. Yeah, we had some of those discussions in the beginning, but I remember us kind of
Mm,
coming back to them, talking about how we're kind of finding them. And it was interesting because one of the things I learned from you, Ish, but I hadn't realized this, that when I was talking about my intentions for getting involved in the research and I was talking about white fragility and white saviorism and this stuff, you actually said that hearing me use those words was kind of quite useful anyway, just for gauging. Um, you used a phrase, I don't know, where the awareness was at or something, and that's something
mm,
that you will be listening for, and maybe other black trainees might be listening for as well, in a way that white trainees don't have to take that into account.
yeah. And this is where it's kind of, well, I think this topic is tricky anyway, but I think when you're then, black isn't a monolith, and then thinking about intersectionality and then like how the different aspects of identity might layer up, what I listen for as a black queer man might not be what someone else listens for example, as someone who's a black woman. So I think, or even if there were another black queer man, we've both had different lived experiences. We might not find the supervisory space useful in the same ways. So I think for me, it's helpful to hear like the language, or like to gauge where my supervisor's awareness is in terms of anti-racist supervision, for example. But someone else might be looking for other things, like maybe something that's more action-based, or um, but I do find those things helpful. Like, is my supervisor bringing and initiating conversations about power dynamics? So it might not even be about race itself, but it might be about the things adjacent to it. Um, And yeah, conversations about power, that's something that I kind of look out for, and very collaborative and like the co-construction of the space. Those are kind of things that I'm like, okay, I'm being considered here, and that makes me feel more able to trust and lean in to that kind of supervisory space.
Oh, thank you. And that warms to some of the themes we sometimes explore in our anti-racist supervision practice. That anti-racist supervision isn't separate from supervision. So being able to talk about power, checking in about well-being, getting feedback, all these things that are
Mm,
bread and butter of everyday practice are, of course, kind of part of anti-racist supervision as well.
yeah.
Um, and I guess the other bit that just from what you were saying about how people are going to have different responses, of course, that you know, anti-racist supervision is something we're going to have to reconstruct with every trainee that we meet with, because it's going to mean something different. But I think what I valued in reading your really careful qualitative analysis was those themes, the things that we might look for across particular dyads, because they're so embedded in this kind of ecology of harm that you've written about. So I'm going to put you on the spot now. I hadn't told you I was going to ask this. Any tips for kind of supervisors, just sort of tabloid one or two things, either that you've observed in a supervisor or you'd wished you'd had from a supervisor to finish?
Gosh, yeah, you are putting me on the spot. Um, I guess from my own personal experience, I find a supervisor that's proactive helpful. So I think, yeah, someone who will bring up and initiate these conversations and take the first step, I find that really helpful. So then maybe, yeah, some a supervisor that's proactive. But I also think there's something that I find helpful about a supervisor being responsive to me and being able to kind of gauge where I'm at and and listen and hear and respond to me, which I think is kind of like an addition to, okay, you're being proactive, but you need to also go at the pace of of the person, right? So I would say being proactive and also maybe something about being responsive to the person in front of you, and going at their pace and it being quite collaborative with that person. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Ish, for your time. And fundamentally, thank you for the sort of quality of your research. I know it's due to be published in the kind of near future, and the audience will be waiting to hear about that. And yeah, we'll share the link when it comes out. But thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Warren.